In this penultimate session, we're going to pick up on the conversation that John Inazu and I had yesterday, and he'll be leading a conversation about virtue, democracy, and civil discourse on campus. As John noted, we are in a particularly divisive moment in the United States, especially on college campuses. John, we're hoping, will bring a bit of his more typical optimism to the conversation. Right? We're not all in this death spiral. But what we have, though I'm not actually sure, Eric Mlyn is seated to his left, who may share some of that grave concern for the nature of democracy in higher education. But we're delighted to have three scholars joining John today: Duke's Eric Mlyn, Roosevelt Montás from Columbia, and John Silvanus Wilson from MIT. And each of these scholars has really grappled with these questions most recently, and really offering very different but important contributions to this conversation about civic virtue, civil discourse on campus. And so with that, I'm just going to leave it to John to corral this fabulous group. So thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be. It's great to be back. The bat has not taken me out yet. And on Death Spiral, I think it just depends on the rate. I mean, it could be a very long death spiral. So I'm not.
Oh, good.
Yeah. That's not for me. That's for higher ed. Just to be clear. And I'm really excited about this panel, especially because I can punt on all from yesterday and ask these guys instead. But I think maybe to get us, what I'd love to do as we walk through this conversation and before we get to questions from all of you is just talk about some of the challenges that come from the various components of higher ed. These are very intricate ecosystems with lots of stakeholders, lots of process questions, lots of substance questions, and I think we'll get into all of those. But maybe to kick us off, maybe each of you could just say a few opening thoughts about the broader question of this panel, which is the relationship and the role of higher education to really ultimately democracy, but how you get there through campus engagement. So any background thoughts about your own views or experiences, and we'll dive into some deeper questions. You want to start, Eric?
Sure. I'm really honored to be part of this warm-up band for Michael Sandel, and looking forward to that. And Suzanne, thanks for inviting me and for putting this together. I'll just say one thing about the project that I'm leading at Duke, at the Kenan Institute for Ethics at Duke, which is called Democracy and the Politics of American Higher Education. The project was originally called Right-Wing Populism and American Higher Education. And my colleagues pushed back. And as I was launching this, said, Eric, you really need to be a little more balanced in what this looks like, and that there are real threats from the left as well to academic freedom and the kinds of values that we very much value in higher education. And I accepted that. I accepted that what I saw as a friendly amendment to the project. My own view is that I don't think we can compare the threats that come, let's say, to free speech from the left to the kinds of state interventions that we're seeing right now at the state level, and the possible interventions that we will be seeing at the federal level should the Republicans take the White House again. So the project has had an evolution. My own view is that right-wing populism, I used to call it Trumpism, that got more pushback than right-wing populism. I think I shouldn't associate this with a person, but that right-wing populism is very much a threat to the central core values of American higher education. That democracy doesn't exist without a vibrant, liberal higher education system, and that our higher education system does not exist without a vibrant, healthy democracy. And that vibrant, healthy democracy is at risk at this moment, and it's incumbent upon us as members of these institutions and our leadership to speak out in defense of liberal democracy at this very important moment. So I've had my own evolution. The project itself has, I'm doing something in a couple of weeks I'm a little frightened of. We're having a gathering in Washington, D.C., where I'm having colleagues from the Heritage Foundation on the right and people from Bernie Sanders' office on the left talk about what the federal role in higher education might look like in 2025. And so the project itself has embraced a wide variety of viewpoints, while I have made my viewpoint on this clear. And that's the kind of hard thing to navigate as we proceed with the project, but we'll get more into that as the panel goes on.
I'm also thrilled to be here. Thank you, Suzanne and Erin, for making that happen. One of the most generative things that has been uttered in the various conversations I've been at is what John said yesterday, and which he then declared he shouldn't have said, which is that higher education is doomed. Obviously, it's an institution that's been around for 1,000 years. But we are at a particular phase in the evolution of higher education, one that I think is characterized by a turn that happens in the 19th century, which is the orientation of the university towards the research mission, right? Towards not the cultivation and preparation of a certain kind of individual for a certain role in society, but reoriented towards the investigation, codification, dissemination of knowledge. And we today live in an institution that has this schizophrenic duality. The bulk of the energy, the dollars, the prestige, the sort of incentives and things that structure the institution are oriented towards research. Even those of us who are in the humanities have to pretend that we do research, that we generate new knowledge to survive and to justify our existence in this behemoth that's oriented towards research. The other mission is of cultivating citizens, of equipping individuals to become certain, to engage in a certain form of life. That certain form of life, in our context, involves democratic living. That is, we live in a democracy, we live in a government, in a form of government where the power, the sovereignty lies with the people. So people have to be equipped to self-govern, both in an individual sense, govern, order, organize your life, and a collective sense, order, organize, determine our collective future. Both of those activities require very particular kinds of cultivations, very particular kinds of skills. Many of them rhetorical, discursive skills, capacity to listen, to examine, to be skeptical, to articulate, to persuade. And these capacities for self-governance are the ones that a liberal education, a character education, a formative education concerns itself with. And we cannot have a democracy unless we have a population that is equipped with these discursive skills of self-governance. That's why our job, the job of higher education, is absolutely critical to the nourishing and the sustenance of a democracy. There's an implication to that, which is that the crisis in democracy in which we are stuck right now is in some way a reflection of a failure of the mission of liberal education. And the way out, if we find a way out, it's going to involve a reorientation and a reinvigoration of this function of the university, which has been neglected and put to the side. Now, of course, the university is not the only institution, it's not the only form in which this kind of education happens, but it is a critical and a fundamental aspect of it. And I'd like to think that that's in part why we're here, and why gatherings like this are happening is part of that necessary existential question about the future of our democracy, this sort of resurgence, interest, and commitment to this form of education.
So we are really singing out the same hymnal here. I begin with gratitude. Thank you for the invitation. I've been really struck by this image here, and in particular the roots. And so I wrote a book that's largely historical, and it talks about this. So the degree to which we're on the same page, John Dewey said in 1916, democracy has to be born anew every generation, and education is its midwife. My book makes a point that higher education in America has been a negligent midwife to democracy. This is about a flourishing democracy. Our democracy is not flourishing. It has never been flourishing for all, not by the design of it. If you listen to Levitsky and Ziblatt, two scholars from Harvard Kennedy School, they argue in a recent book a couple months ago that democracy, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, was the moment of America's democratization. That was the birth of it. Because that was the first time in American history when a critical mass of Americans as citizens had a chance to exert their will over the direction of the country. So basically for 60 years, we have been really getting to the heart of this experiment. And by no stretch, by no argument, are we yet flourishing. So the flourishing is to come. As a matter of fact, what I argue in my book is that there's only been one subsector of American higher education that has taken the midwife role seriously, and that's America's historically black colleges. Because in the middle of the last century, they very deliberately and aggressively started shaping the soldiers and the generals of a civil rights movement that made the Voting Rights Act happen and a number of other things. So at the same time, places like Harvard, and I'm a graduate of Morehouse and Harvard, they were about something very different. And you don't have to take it from me. I know Harvard well. I have 3 degrees from Harvard. I was advisor to 2 presidents and on the board. So I know Harvard well, but my viewpoint is, take it from Bill Gates, one of the most prominent graduates of Harvard, who was at Harvard from 1973 to 1975 and dropped out to become Bill Gates. And basically, he returned in 2007. And he expressed in his commencement address in 2007 a lament. He said, I left Harvard with no real awareness of the awful inequities and the appalling disparities in health and wealth and opportunity that condemn millions, and he later said billions, to lives of despair. And I want to ask, I asked on Monday on the first night, why didn't the civil rights movement happen 100 years before it did? I graduated from Morehouse with a lot of other guys, acutely aware of everything to which Bill Gates was blind. Because our institutions, Morehouse was about democracy, Harvard was about aristocracy. And that's where we are. We're between those polarities. And if Dewey is right, we have to become more about democracy. I want to make one more point. And that is about, I was head of the Millennium Leadership Initiative at ASCU for a couple of years. And I advanced this notion of we need high definition institutions. And that requires high definition presidents. And what I mean by that is we used to have them. Can you go back again to the roots at the birth, toward the birth of American higher education? We had what were called abolitionist colleges. They were looking at society. Now, this is before the Calvin Report. that advised agnosticism and reticence in the face of atrocity. So it's before Calvin. They said there were institutions born and made their identity based on human enslavement is wrong. So they were not agnostic and silent in the face of what was going on. And that's why I disagree with what Harvard is doing now, and I disagree with the embrace of the Calvin report. And the only final thing I'll say about that is, and I'm sorry if I'm getting to that sooner than you may have wanted to, but basically, there is an exception clause in the Calvin report, and that's very important. And the thing you need to know about it is the writers of the Calvin report, this was 1967. You fast forward to 2007, 40 years after the Calvin report is the thing, and there is a controversy. There is something going on across the world, and institutions were grappling with it. It was Darfur. 400,000 people had been killed in a genocide in Darfur, and University of Chicago was struggling, and they were having a debate on campus, and basically they got in touch with the only living member left who signed that, who helped create it, was on the committee at the table with Professor Calvin and created that. And his name was John Hope Franklin. And John Hope Franklin said, he went back to Chicago and said, yes, there is an exception. When there is a genocide or some other kind of atrocity like that going on in the world, it makes sense for institutions to speak out. Full stop.
Okay, we're going to dive into a bunch of things, but I want to first zoom out or maybe blow it up some more and ask, in a discussion about democracy, are we in this room on this panel overly influenced by an aristocracy that has convinced itself that it's a meritocracy?
Oh my.
Not to name any names, but the Ivy League and schools adjacent to it. And I just wonder about having conversations about the future of democracy with very, present company excluded, very little representation of HBCUs, land-grant universities, smaller regional schools, Valencia College and other two-year schools. This is not a critique of this gathering, but I just mean the general discourse around these questions of the future of democracy and who's invited to express input on those questions.
Yeah, it's a great question, John. I have a thought about that, which is, as we talk about elite higher education and this particular issue, I think about an example, and the example is during the Trump presidency, conservatives put forward a proposal that passed that was an endowment tax on the richest institutions in the country, right? So the endowment tax now pertains to those institutions that have, I think, $500,000 or more of endowment per undergraduate. And for those institutions, there's a 1.4% tax on their endowment earnings. It's chump change, right? I think last year that endowment tax yielded $67 million for the federal government. What's interesting to me about that, and to your question, John, is that in my conversations so 33 institutions are subject to that tax. Notre Dame is, MIT is, Harvard is, Duke is. And those kinds of institutions are. And when I asked that question at my own institution at Duke, and I said to people in government relations, I know this is coming from the right, I know it's kind of like a little bit of a poke at elite liberal higher education, but what if we took that and said, tax our endowments? What's it at Notre Dame, 20 billion? At Duke it's 14 billion? These are, in this world of inequality, these are hard to defend. So what I wish in terms of aristocracy and meritocracy is that we, even on the left, looked at that endowment tax and said, yeah, I think it's actually not a bad idea to tax the endowments of these fabulously wealthy institutions and use it to fund free community college, or use it to fund HBCUs, or it's a non-starter at my institution to even open the crack in that door. And I think that is a little bit to what you're saying, John, and I wish we could think of that anew. I'm not dying to be taxed, but I think it would make a really important point to the more general population, of higher education, that those of us who have been fortunate and blessed enough to end up at these institutions also realize that we have a lot to share.
There is a whiff of elitism and exclusion and privilege that attaches to liberal education, continues to attach to liberal education, and it's a true perception. Liberal education has been the province of the privileged, the elite, historically, and part of the novelty of the American higher education system, particularly after the 1944-45 GI Bill, is to make higher education accessible, not to an elite, but to the population at large. In the theme of democracy, we cannot have a democracy that is in which liberal education continues to be this privileged affect of privilege. The danger I see, liberal education obviously is in a kind of institutional crisis. I don't think that it is a existential crisis in the sense that the wealthy and the privileged will continue to seek out and pay for liberal education for their children. The challenge that is facing us, and a battle which we are losing, is to make liberal education truly general democratic education. The path towards which we're heading is the retrenchment of liberal education to bastions of privilege. And I have had so many conversations with leaders of elite institutions that absolutely balk at the kind of investments and the kind of aggressive recruitment of non-privileged individuals that is required to address this question and this situation. It's not going to happen automatically. It's not going to happen unless we make it a priority, a social priority, to expand the reach of liberal education, to create the ladders of access for the non-privileged to the kind of education that we have been privileged to have. My whole higher education has been at elite institution, at one elite institution, actually. I got there sort of accidentally. I immigrated to the United States when I was 12, poor, went to a local public school in New York, sort of by accident, stumbled into this kind of education. It utterly transformed my life, the way I see the world, my capacity to act on the world. Subsequent to that, I've been running a program for high school students from low-income backgrounds who are the first in their families to attend college. We run out of Columbia. Every year, bring 45 rising high school students, this demographic, and put in front of them Plato, Aristotle, Thucydides, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, texts from the American Revolution, the Civil Rights Movement, and see what it does to them. And what I have seen is that these students awaken and are reoriented in their vision of themselves and the world in such a fundamental and powerful way. And one of the things that tells me is that if we manage to make accessible the kind of education that we're all here to celebrate and to advance to those people who have not had access to that kind of education, to people from demographics and from subgroups that have been structurally barred from access to this, that this kind of education is as transformative, as illuminating, as empowering for them as it is for anybody else. So it seems to me that one fundamental challenge that we have is not just to keep this kind of education alive, but to broaden the reach of this kind of education and to take it aggressively, proactively, prioritizing access to this kind of education to populations that have been traditionally excluded from it.
I think that's right. It's a great question. I think one of the ways to make progress on it is for gatherings like this to go 10x and 100x and really get going. I do think that I was sharing with Paul yesterday an article in the New York Times about 10 days ago called "What Do Students at Elite Colleges Really Want?" A lot of you read it. It should worry us all because basically it's not just, it doesn't just illuminate the wealth chase that's going on, but a lot of the students who were interviewed from elite colleges unabashedly said, as for doing good, you have to do well first. The act of doing good comes when you have money and you give out your money. So it's all about doing well, getting rich, chasing the dollars. That kind of mindset runs counter to why we're gathered here, pretty much. Even though we could use a lot of grants to get this thing stood up and get it going, we have to find the right kind of people, and I appreciate those who have funded this effort. But this is all about values, and assertion of values, and that's, I've had conversations with David Brooks before, and we've talked about that, and that conversation was a piece of one we've already had. I have to say, since I'm at Notre Dame, my perception of Notre Dame, I valorized Notre Dame. I really thought Notre Dame was magical, and it had nothing at all to do with football. Nothing to do with football. It was because Father Hesburgh marched with Martin Luther King in 1964 in Chicago. And when I was a little kid then, but I went to a church where was pastored by a Morehouse man, and he got the whole church's attention on that. There were a couple of rabbis. Rabbi Heschel was there too. That gathering, that pairing, was magical, and because it was King. It's one of the reasons why this pastor of the church was a Morehouse graduate, and I think he talked about Morehouse more than he talked about Jesus in the pulpit. I mean, really, from the pulpit. We thought he was a Morehouse man, King was a Morehouse man. We thought Jesus went to Morehouse, so I went to Morehouse. A lot of us went to Morehouse, and so, but we looked at Notre Dame and saw that, and that was the biggest statement ever made about Notre Dame to me. And I think Notre Dame has gotten away from that. Imagine a college president, any college president, walking in a march for social good these days. I don't know if you don't do it. It's counter to the fundraising imperatives. You'll anger too many people, too many donors, and be in trouble. But that was courage, and we need that back.
That's the high definition leader that you're.
That's HD leadership.
I think about Father Hesburgh. Something to what you said, John, made me think. I went for a long walk on campus early this morning, and there are a lot of plaques on this campus, and there are a lot of plaques on my campus too. And it just made me think, like, our students who say, you know what, I think the first thing we need to do is do well, make money, and then we can be philanthropic. Well, how are they not getting that message walking on these campuses with the plaques all over the place? And, on my campus, you don't know if you have an appointment in Rubenstein Hall, named for David Rubenstein, one of our very generous donors. There's like 6 Rubenstein Halls at Duke University right now. You often end up in the wrong place. But who's celebrated on our campuses are the philanthropists, and I deeply value what they've done and allowed us to do. And yet we have to understand, I think, the message in the DNA of our institutions of what we celebrate. Who are our commencement speakers? Jerry Seinfeld was the commencement speaker at Duke this year. Children go to Duke, become a very important donor to the university. So I just wanted to note that.
I want to underscore that because when I attended Morehouse, I lived in W.B. Du Bois Hall and worshiped in King Chapel. And I spoke about my book recently in North Carolina. And North Carolina A&T has a statue in front of it now of the 4 students who did the sit-in. And they're memorialized forever. And that's who the heroes are. And
that's what they're seeing on their early morning
That's what
walk.
they're seeing. That's what they're seeing on their campuses.
Yeah.
And most HBCU campuses, the dorm names are after people who were in the civil rights movement and that's the message you're getting. It's a very different message than the message I got at Harvard. And of course, there are institutions like Yale and others that are removing the names of slaveholders from their dormitories and other buildings now because of that legacy. And it's a very different signal that you send in that.
Another part of Notre Dame that I love is on the morning walk, you also encounter a very large cemetery, which is a useful visual to think about what we're doing.
I was struck by that this morning, yeah.
Again, I'm really an optimistic person. I want to read a quote from John from a recent article he wrote to take us a little closer to this question of future strategy, access, equity toward democracy. You wrote that for both trustees and campus leaders, we should understand that the common good is well served when an institution's overall enrollment and faculty evolve to look more like the world that current students may eventually lead rather than the world their great-grandfathers grew up in. So I love that observation, but it immediately occurs to me that both trustees and tenured faculty can be impediments to that kind of vision. So how do we think about this? I would love all of you to comment on the role of faculty in cracking, especially what seem to be sort of counter incentives that come with tenure and other protections, maybe. And then John to talk about trustees, particularly because I think most faculty and certainly almost all students have no idea of the role of trustees in these enterprises and connected to the questions we're talking about.
It's an interesting point about trustees, John. You mentioned that this morning over breakfast. I think actually the role, I think what we're seeing in higher education and populist attacks on higher education have heightened the role of trustees in our public institutions, right, in public higher education. So I know, for example, at UNC Chapel Hill, our gem of an institution down the road where I started my career, students and faculty are deeply aware now of the Board of Trustees because the Board of Trustees has become so politicized. And so they go to Board of Trustees meetings. They know that the Board of Trustees just cut $2.3 million from diversity, equity, and inclusion funding, reallocated that toward the campus police, which the system has said is not allowed to happen. So I think that's one thing. The second thing, and I have mixed feelings about this question of faculty governance. I think the entire attack on elite higher education is an attack on our autonomy. And faculty governance is part of that autonomy, with faculty saying, we determine the curriculum, we determine what is taught in our classrooms, and we determine how it is taught. And I think also that is being sidelined right now, particularly in state institutions where legislatures have become more and more involved. I also think the thing we need to be very aware of at places like Duke and Notre Dame and MIT and Harvard and the elite institutions is that what the right is very clear about is what we've done at the state level in Florida, North Carolina, we're going to do at the federal level in 2025 if we regain the White House. And the levers that we're going to use are different than those levers that are at the state level, but here are the levers we're going to use. This is not a conspiracy, it's a political argument, and it's right in front of us. And that will further further marginalize faculty in the governance of our institutions. Is that a good or a bad thing? I won't comment on that particular part of it.
When Erin and Suzanne first asked me to be on this panel, and I agreed, I wonder, in retrospect, if I had known how the year would come to a crashing end at Columbia, I would have agreed to be on a panel that would deal with something like civil discourse on campus. What I've seen in the last 2 months at Columbia, the breakdown in community that has happened, one of the things that has been most saddening to me has been the role of faculty. Students obviously are passionate, are not good at nuance and complexity, are embracing issues that they feel some kind of moral clarity about, and are eager to act on that and make demands. And I can excuse a lot about students' behavior that I can't quite excuse from faculty. The faculty has not discharged its intellectual leadership in a way that commands my respect. So it's sort of shown this harsh light on a kind of rot in our faculty culture. The way in which professional incentives and the shape of the academic career has produced in the faculty a kind of interest group that's often ideologically committed to causes that are external to the university's mission. And they are placed in this position within universities. So take Columbia as an example. So Columbia University, if you look at it as a financial entity, as a revenue generating entity, its biggest chunk is a health science and biomedical complex, which includes a hospital, research labs, medical school. That is its biggest sort of financial footprint. Next to that comes its real estate holdings. It's a huge real estate company in Manhattan. And next to that come a huge portfolio investment. Then come alumni and other philanthropic donations. And somewhere down the line they're the professional schools. Somewhere along the lines there comes the arts and sciences, which from the outside, when you look from the outside at these big institutions, what you see is the college and the arts and sciences, but those entities are in fact very tiny minority stakeholders in the whole institution. So it's not clear to me today what latitude there is at the university level to express and commit themselves to any kind of moral or ethical issue. The institutions as they exist today are the historical products of this complex, capital-intensive flows and aggregations. And I come back to John's comment of yesterday about there may be something fundamental about the structures of our institutions that prevents them from doing the kind of work that we're committed to and the kind of work that we recognize as sort of the soul of the institution. I don't know what that means in the long run. One of the things it could mean is that I was going to say symbiotic relationship, but I'm not sure that that's the right framework. But this coexistence between the traditional historical mission of the university and the thing that it has become, it may be that those two are fundamentally incompatible. And it may be that we are looking at a model of higher education that separates those two. You know, again, using Columbia, but this extends to many other places. At Columbia, you have Columbia University, and in it, there's Columbia College. Columbia College founded in 1754. It's sort of the original school. But these two places, Columbia College, an undergraduate residential liberal arts college, lives inside this behemoth that has the same name and has the same campus, but it's actually up to something fundamentally different. And I think we have to rethink whether the current structure of the university is conducive, is compatible with the fundamental commitments that we are advancing here and the fundamental commitments that remain as a kind of legacy, as a kind of vestige within these large institutions.
And that was very powerful. Thank you. And I'll say that kind of point and this kind of discussion is why trusteeship is so important. I have equated it to hypertension, the silent killer. By the time you are aware of it and its power, it might be too late. So campuses, but I in my book, Hope and Healing, Black Colleges and the Future of American Democracy, I devote a whole chapter to trusteeship. And the chapter is called The Iceberg Trustees. Why do I call it that? It's because not many people know this, but there was a governance failure, a trusteeship failure that was behind the reason why so many lives were lost in the Titanic. What am I talking about? Well, the governing board in London it had one mission, and that is to ensure the safety of the vessel. And one of the things toward the top of the checklist is lifeboats. But they were negligent in their job. So instead of ensuring there were enough lifeboats, they were looking at a luxury liner on its maiden voyage, and they looked at the design of it and they said, we need more deck chairs. And they removed some lifeboats to put deck chairs for the comfort of the passengers. So in my book, I juxtapose and challenges colleges to ask whether you have deck chair trustees or iceberg trustees. You should have iceberg trustees paying attention to the threats. What you've brought up are the threats, the things on the horizon, the things that trustees should be paying attention to. But we have a lot of trustees that are paying attention to deck chairs, and that's the wrong thing. You have trustees in Florida that are helping to ban books and shut down DEI offices. That's a deck chair trusteeship. It's a definition of the wrong thing to do. In North Carolina, with Nicole Hannah-Jones, things like that. That's not what trusteeship is for. That's deck chair. It's the wrong thing. It should be iceberg trusteeship. And I hope you need to go back to your institutions and ask. Well, read that chapter first. Buy the book and read that chapter, and then explore that issue.
We're going to turn it over to you all for questions in just a minute, but I want to first make a comment riffing on what we've just heard and what Roosevelt was saying in particular, because as we've been talking, it's been occurring to me, we've framed some of our discussions so far around the questions of how do we form and habituate students into certain sets of virtues and dispositions, but what if the real problem is more us than the students, right? What if we are being the ones malformed and deformed by the institutions in which we serve or work or benefit? And it just seems to me that faculty, myself included, are so incentivized and often wired to be self-interested and self-maximizing. I lost my dad to cancer about 5 years ago in Colorado Springs, and I thought for a while about taking a leave of absence and trying to get an appointment at the Air Force Academy near his house to teach for a semester while he was dying. And frankly, I looked at the requirements and it said, if you do a visit here, you have to be in your office from 8 to 5 every day, and you have to, no travel. And I thought, there's no way I'm doing that. That's not the job I signed up for. And there's just, I said it a little bit ashamedly. I'm not sure they would have wanted me to come anyway, but I think so many of us maximize our own interests even when we tell ourselves we're doing something differently, and then hand in hand with administrators and other actors, we just kind of let them call the shots. So I don't actually know what faculty governance is anymore, at least at my institution. I mean, no one had heard of the faculty senate until they decided to pass resolutions 2 weeks ago. And we have these pointless university committees that are all top down and take up all of our time, but there's very little collective action from the ground up saying we as faculty are collectively working toward the central purpose, mission, and values of this institution. We just, do our own things and wait for the administrators to tell us where to show up for meetings. And so I mean, that's a bleak view, but I think it's actually somewhat realistic at a lot of our schools. And it makes me wonder if there are things we should be thinking about to challenge ourselves before we go on to challenge our students. Questions from you for this panel?
So in light of what you've just talked about, it seems like, at least my experience in higher ed, the way faculty are evaluated at the end of our term or whenever, in the annual reports, most of the factors are related to what I have done in terms of my own professional contributions to the profession. Very little input, even asking the question, what am I doing to help the institution accomplish its mission, its purpose? How am I investing in students to generate people who will go out from our institution, represent what we believe in, what we say we stand for? I think I heard David Brooks talk about we don't even know as institutions what our real purpose is. And so that seems to be a blurring. And I guess my question would be, how can we as faculty help guide the direction of the assessment of us that will let us produce virtue in students, that they will go out and do things that will make a difference in the world?
One thing I would say is that I think at least the way things are now, the professional incentives are such that they discourage real faculty engagement with the running of the institutions. Similarly, they discourage real faculty engagement with the lives of our students. You probably all know quite well that if you get one of those coveted assistant professorships, tenure track at an elite institution, your future is going to depend on how little time you can get away with teaching and paying attention to students. That your career is going to depend on your ability to avoid doing this thing and focus all of your energy on other projects, other endeavors that are recognized and that are rewarded. So just like in order for us to take our humanistic, cultivating character education mission seriously, we have to either sacrifice or risk some aspect of our professional advancement. In the same way, to get involved in administration, to get involved in the running of the institution, it does require that same kind of risk and that same kind of reprioritization. But I think it's something that needs to happen. That is, we faculty members need to be getting involved in committees, get involved in budget conversations, get involved in a serious way in the running of the institution. Put ourselves in positions where our vision, our ideas, our commitments, our priorities matter, make a difference. Again, I think there is some question whether the ecosystem of the institutions will allow that, will make that possible. But it seems to me that if we care about the institutions, if we want to make a serious bid for reorienting the ship, we have to get over this reluctance to get involved in the management, in the affairs of running the institutions. Do get involved in committees, in representative bodies, in faculty senates, in policy making. We have too long just prioritized our own individual interests. and have really walked away from involvement in the life of the students and the life of the institutions and handed that over to a cadre of professional administrators. And we are seeing our institutions being shaped by those visions and those priorities and that training. So I think we have to get more involved.
I was going to answer your question in one way and then realized it was a naive answer, but I'll share it with you anyway. Just as I was thinking about it, I've been involved in the sort of civic engagement movement in higher education for a long time, and I watched in meeting like this over 20 years, our working on tenure and promotion requirements somehow including the civic work of faculty, whether that's a service learning course, whether that's a summer civic project where students and faculty are working with communities. With very few exceptions, that was a failure. I believe Michigan State has some very clear guidance in there. I think University of Minnesota, where my PhD is from, has some guidance there. So that's been a frustrating kind of endeavor. So my first answer to you was going to be, well, what we need to do is evaluate faculty, at least in part, on how they're contributing to the fundamental democratic mission of our institutions. Have a part there that just says something about that, whether you're an engineer or a political scientist. But maybe that's a naive hope, given the 20 years I've watched of trying to include the civic movement there.
Very briefly, I think, Paul, it's about values and the values of the institution. I started my career at the birth of the billion-dollar capital campaign era, 1985-86, and I have seen the values of the faculty. This was 16 years at MIT, but I've seen it elsewhere. Had good peripheral vision, and have seen the values of the faculty skew toward that, because that is the corner of the realm. If you come up with an initiative that is worthy to be included in the next capital campaign at your institution, you become a rock star. And so in the same way that our students are chasing the wealth, our faculty are doing the same thing. So there's a distortion that is going on, and it's a deep problem. Shorter answers.
You want to
shorter answers.
Taking control of this panel.
Yeah, she said shorten our answers, guys. That's what she said.
Well, this is a pretty quick question, but are there venues, conferences, communities of trustees, administrators, provosts who are having these same kind of virtues and conversations that we are? Or is there virtues and vocations for those folks?
John, do you know? You would be most equipped to answer that.
I'm still looking. I mean, I don't think I haven't seen it rise up to the board level. I'm worried about that because most of the boards of which I'm aware are focused on other things. I'll say one exception, Spelman College. I used to be on the board there, and it is a very solid institution. They invited me back because of my book dovetails with what they're about now, but they just had a trustee to give them $100 million and $25 million designated to elevate their voice with respect to the trajectory of American democracy. I'm like, whoa. Now, it's going to take more than $25 million. It's going to take more than Spelman. But that's a statement of values from the board that I think is rare. And I know this is not top down, it's as much bottom up, but the top can topple things if and when they want to, and they do it quite well, and they do it like hypertension works, a silent killer. They just kill things, and I've seen that again and again. So I'm a little worried about that. I don't think this has gone viral yet.
Thank you, guys. I've been sitting here thinking about the current state of higher education and the death spiral and whether or not that is in fact happening. But one of the things that's been running through my head is the adjunctification of faculty. So roughly 60% of faculty are adjuncts who teach across the arts and sciences, and this is particularly in the humanities. Most adjuncts make under $40,000 a year, are employed on precarious contracts, so are liable to be fired should they do anything that doesn't seem to advance the mission of the institution. If they stand up for students, they're in particular kinds of precarious positions. And most adjuncts are women or people of color. And so this, you can see how this inequality is falling. And so when the conversation comes to faculty, what is it that faculty are doing? I think about all the adjuncts who are faculty, but are not in any way really ensconced in the university, right? They don't participate in faculty senate or in any kinds of committees. They rarely show up at department meetings. They're not a part of curriculum conversations, at most universities at least. And yet these are the people who do the lion's share of the teaching of undergraduates, who are teaching Intro to Philosophy 1, 2, and 5, right? Across the institution. So I just wondered if you could speak to, as you're thinking about, perfect, Siri has an answer. In the realm of abolitionist university studies or critical university studies, there's been a handful of scholars in the subfield thinking about what it is to remake the university. And this is coming particularly from indigenous feminist perspectives of thinking about what it is to enact a university that takes seriously the character, right, the democratic mission of midwifing a liberal society, to sort of draw back to Dewey. So I just wondered if you could think more or say more about what you mean by faculty. When you say it, are you only thinking tenure-track faculty, or do you have this expansive, inclusive vision and dealing with the inequality within the faculty and the way the university has structured what it is to be faculty?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know really quite what to say, except that it's a scandal, the adjunctification of the faculty, that it reveals the priorities of institutions, that most of the teaching, or so much of the teaching, in most places, most of the teaching, most of the fundamental gen ed basic education of undergraduates is done by adjuncts. It's telling of the larger priorities of the institutions. When I was talking about faculty before, I was thinking about tenure track and tenure faculty because they are the ones that have an institutional voice. They are the ones who have some protection from retaliation or firing for challenging or questioning the way that the university is being run. But I say that simply just pragmatically, because adjunct faculty and other forms of non-tenure track faculty are sort of structurally excluded from the governance bodies and from the community of scholarship, and it is scandalous that is the case, and shameful that is the case. In some places like at Barnard, at Columbia, adjuncts have form unions, and that happens in other places, and that gives them some protections and some power. There is a danger to that, right? Because it can then become another interest group. So I absolutely agree with the point that you're making of the sort of the poverty of vision and culture, that the fact that so much of the university depends on this exploited class of laborers. Yeah.
I'm going to continue with the death spiral. You mentioned the rate of death spiral, John, and for so many other universities, the rate is accelerating. And this year, I fear that we're going to see a lot of institutions collapse because of the FAFSA debacle and the margins are so slim with enrollments coming in this fall. And so I'm wondering, for education and institutions collapsing, are you hopeful for a post-university world? Or is there a way of imagining liberal education that is outside of the way we've structured it within universities, kind of a para-university, if you will. And so just wondering, I think there's pessimism, and yet I think I also sense there's hope that we can find ways to continue a liberal education apart from universities that seem to be incoherent and doomed.
Hope.
Oh, yeah, no, I love it.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing that comes to my mind is if we could somehow structurally re-incentivize, especially with our grad students, that there's this sort of weird, elusive carrot of getting the tenure track job at the research university and having all the goodies. I mean, especially if we take people seriously, saying they want to see social change and democracy. I mean, if the future of democracy is really at stake, then let's get a whole bunch of people with quality master's degrees teaching at two-year universities and do liberal arts there and invest in infrastructure and money there and not worry about, like the waterways next to the big dorms and like 3-course meals and all of that stuff, but focus on the education piece. And there might be a way in which AI can complement some of this as well, but I think we're too much in the prestige-oriented game right now to see that as a reality. I don't know anyone else.
I wouldn't agree, but I think the issue, the real challenge of your question to me is we have to examine whether or not we are ready to completely reimagine it, to get off this treadmill we've been on, the chase, the wealth chase, and everything else. And I'm not sure we are. I really do think there is a kind of don't look up a mentality here that is going on even with us in higher education. There's a professor named Carney who was running around the halls of MIT in the 1960s saying the earth is warming in the 1960s. And he convened the first group that got us all the way to where we are now. He passed away 20-some years ago, but you sound like a Carney with that question. There are people who are wondering if we can get beyond this, and we really don't listen to them because we can't bear to think that we're doomed in any kind of way. And we have to have the capacity. One of the things I say, and this is the final thing I say, I do a critique of college presidents. And I say the problem is we have too many people with a contractor mindset becoming college presidents. We need more architects. We need an architectural instinct in the presidency now to re-architect this thing. But the incentives and the boards are looking for contractors who can just execute and keep the herd moving west. And that's a problem.
I'll say two quick things about this. One is, I think we all acknowledge that there's a crisis in the humanities and there's a crisis in liberal education in universities. And of course, liberal education covers a wider field than the humanities. That crisis is institutional. The humanities are thriving in the world, in the arts, in creative, literary, study groups, reading groups. There is actually an explosion of liberal learning and activity and inquiry and humanistic activity in the world. The crisis is institutional, and it is a function of some of these forces that we're talking about. So that's the one thing. The second thing is that even within our institutions, and particularly in America, there is a long tradition of humanistic learning, of liberal studies. About a third of almost every bachelor's degree is dedicated to what we call general education, but it's really liberal education. So there is a kind of remnant in our institutions that I don't think we can or should abandon, that it's important. And gatherings like this, David Brooks in his opening remarks talked about sort of this being a moment of renewal, of advancement, of growth, because the sort of rot that we've been describing here creates a vacuum and a hunger a need for the thing that we're offering. There are undergraduate students, the 18, 19, 20-year-old students who show up in our classrooms who are hungry and needing this kind of education and this kind of approach. So that need continues to exist there. So it creates a lot of opportunities for us to renew and strengthen and invest in that. And I see it all over the place. I travel a lot to different schools, and there are, in a lot of places, in almost every place, pockets of real growth and activity and vibrant engagement with this tradition. And I think that the fight is continuing, and we need to keep fighting it there. I think it's too soon, and maybe it's way too soon to give up that fight inside the university. There is a need and a space there in which that can, should, and is happening.
Last question.
All right. Well, my name's Ryan Juskis. Thank you so much for this really thoughtful panel. I appreciate this. And kind of preface the question just to say, and I'm so glad that climate change just came up, actually, because I think that's actually connected to this, and I want to draw some attention to that. It's one of the things I've been thinking about this whole conference, about education, about human flourishing, is this question of the environmental dimension, the climate dimensions of these questions. We think, well, what are those connections? It doesn't make much sense. But Dr. Montás, the very kind of narrative you drew attention to about the university becoming the research university, right, over the last 120, 50 years or so, really tracks as well us becoming an oil society, right? So that tracks the growth of petroleum in this country, in the growth of our economy, and in the growth of our institutions. And so these institutions becoming more of the research university, say, and maybe less of the kind of citizen and civic education tracks as well, this kind of influence of, say, oil money. So bringing climate change, right? If we're going to be thinking about institutions like this, like Notre Dame, wonderful institutions, right, that have grown and developed and kind of a model with and through, in many ways, the sort of resources made available through, say, petroleum and fossil fuels more generally, right? We're in this moment of reckoning where we realize, okay, in a sense, we've got to figure out how to be these wonderful institutions after, right? In a transition away from, say, fossil fuels and that sort of thing. And so my point being that, right, when we look at sort of the structure of our universities, the structure of our society, the growth and challenges to democracy, there's a whole, I think, kind of environmental and climate question that's underlying a lot of it. We know we need some big changes around the ways we live with the natural world, for instance, right? So that's kind of the preface here. And it's gotten some scholars in more recent years thinking about the role of human flourishing and how that is connected or not connected, say, to economic growth or to economic development and those sorts of things. It seems to be connected to some degree, and then those paths diverge, and human flourishing is not necessarily, right, dependent on then kind of a kind of limitless growth model. And so when we're thinking about a kind of university, higher education, human flourishing, these are some of the questions I'm bringing. And I want to bring it back to this populist question that was kind of brought up right in the beginning, right? Populism is lots of different things, right? There have been many populist movements in this country, often really incoherent and whatnot. Some people would even say, to quote another recent New York Times piece, right, that actually what we're seeing is actually a remarkable bipartisanship right now in this country among neo-populists from both the left and the right. A very interesting observation, that one that I'm kind of trying to wrestle with. But my point being that if there's anything I think that's coherent to various populist movements, oftentimes not driven by coherence, maybe more by emotion or perception or these sorts of things. But if there is anything that brings it together, right, it's a kind of anti-elitism, or at least against the forces that are invested in the way the world is, and not the way that maybe it should be, or something to that effect. And so part of what my question here is, if kind of we took kind of the populist sentiments, left, right, most generously, and heard it as a challenge to our elite institutions to kind of hold them accountable to the people, in a sense. If we listen to that, what questions might we ask? What ideas might we consider?
Let me let Eric answer that briefly. And then
Sure,
we'll wrap up.
I'll be really brief. I'm aware of the time, Aaron, and I know you probably want to get us moving. I so appreciate your question and your observation about populism, right? We've always had sort of versions of left-wing populism and right-wing populism in the United States. The thing I would say about that is they're both anti-elite. Right-wing populists are anti-expertise, anti-science, in some, and thus very much anti what we do, right? I mean, very much against expertise, which is what we pretend, or in some cases, rightfully own. Left-wing populism is also anti-elite, but like sort of the Bernie Sanders populism is much more aimed at economic elites rather than intellectual elites. So I think there's lessons to be learned there, right? We are institutions of economic elites being attacked by right-wing populists who are sort of anti-expertise. And so I think that is really where the threat to our very mission comes from.
Okay, join me in thanking this panel. Thanks.